Our third project presentation is with Dake, with assistance from Jeff Smith. Dana is a transportation professional who has worked for over 3 years in the environmental services section at the Michigan Department of Transportation. She recently graduated from Michigan State University with a master's degree in urban and regional planning with a research focus on connected and autonomous vehicles. Dana's student-led faculty-guided project intends to shed new light on autonomous vehicles and the impacts of this new form of mobility. Her project was to analyze sustainable design and urban planning techniques that are involved in the development of autonomous vehicles and the economic, social, and environmental infrastructure that will be needed in Michigan as technology progresses. Are you there, Dana?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi, Dana.
Hi, can you hear me?
Can't hear ya.
All right, what about now? Can you hear me?
You might have to, let's see. I can hear her fine, somebody's saying.
Oh.
I can't hear Dana. So I don't know why that is. Okay, well, you know what? If everybody else can hear and I can't, then I guess that's the way it goes.
Oh, that's a bummer.
So go ahead, the floor is yours if everyone's hearing you. And I'll work on my tech end, I guess.
All right, let's see. Share screen. Presentation view. All right, hopefully everybody can see my presentation. Maybe if we could put a comment. Let's see. All right. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for attending my virtual presentation. Again, my name is Dana Dake and I'm so excited to be here virtually today on this platform. Over the past year, I have been working on the Michigan Connected Transport Initiative, which is a self-guided project funded through REI's program. I've had a great time working with stakeholders, the public, everybody that's been involved. This has been a huge project for me. Essentially, as Jen mentioned, this project sheds light on electric and connected and autonomous vehicles and the impacts that this new form of mobility will have on individuals and on businesses. Now, the main focus originally for this project was the Mid-Michigan Connected Transport Initiative. And that was essentially because I was working with the Tri-County region, and I found that due to the nature of awareness on connected and autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles and this sort of future mobility aspect, was that we really had to expand our stakeholder engagement to people more so in the metro area or even the Southeast Michigan area, because that's where some of the expertise was. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right on into this and kind of just shedding some light on the Michigan Connected Transport Initiative and what it is. As the screen reads, it's an approach to identifying synergies between connected mobility and sustainable development by investing in emerging transportation technologies that influence the way in which individuals, communities, and businesses function. So diving in a little bit deeper, as I was stating, the automotive and transportation industries are rapidly evolving to meet modern trends that enhance safety, efficiency, and resiliency. Some of these trends include electric charging stations, autonomous driving, shared mobility, and digital ride-hailing services, to name just a few. But as connected mobility evolves, we must consider how the reinvention of our roads influences the socioeconomic and the biophysical environments that surround us. This creates a unique opportunity to evaluate necessary changes in policy and infrastructure. So really, the goal of this project is to provide an overview at the beginning of the criteria that was used to create the Mid-Michigan Connected Transport Initiative, which has further expanded into a statewide kind of planning tool or planning methodology that is formed for MPOs to use and implement as a community-based initiative, while considering best planning practices and techniques that leverage Michigan's auto-based economy. So really, we're in a unique situation where we're trying to identify what the future mobility looks like, how safety can be at the forefront of autonomous driving and autonomous vehicles, where we also have the auto industry that's very interested in the same aspects. And of course, as you know, Michigan is home to many of the tier 1 OEMs. So moving a little bit further into some of the stakeholder involvement that I completed as part of this project, looking at how the Michigan Connected Transport Initiative could be connected to a broader, more global concept when speaking in terms of planning practices. I identified the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations 2030 Agenda, as they have identified 17 different goals that, as you can see on the screen, relate from poverty issues to good health and well-being, sustainable cities and communities. And if you're not familiar with the 2030 Agenda, I really encourage you to take some time to look at these, because each one of these targets has associated goals, several associated goals. And through a systematic review of the literature and current publications on future mobility, I found that there are quite a few different themes that when associating future mobility to sustainable development goals, there were some layers that corresponded to one another. And so really the foundation of this Michigan Connected Transport Initiative is interlaying and connecting these sustainable development goals. Now, not all 17 of them, but the 5 based on publications that were seen to connect directly to mobility. And so this presentation is going to go into those 5 sustainable development goals and how I related them through this REI project to mobility. So the report is based on several different working group discussions, and each working group focused on one specific transport-related SDG, or Sustainable Development Goals. And each one of these stakeholder groups were provided a set of targets to discuss. Now, as I mentioned, each one of these SDGs has specific global targets. So what I did was go into those global targets that are available online, and I shifted them, or I used the ones that related to mobility, and I included targets such as autonomous vehicles or connected vehicles or electric vehicles or ITS development. So in essence, I applied these goals to the niche field of future mobility. And those targets were what the stakeholder groups discussed. And what we looked at was identifying the interrelated variables and evaluating the linkages necessary to achieve these SDG targets or desired outcomes. The process in which all of these 5 different stakeholder groups was to identify proactive planning techniques and elements of sustainable design for vehicle connectivity. So, all right, right here, what is the Michigan Connected Transport Initiative? Again, it's a strategic and transferable framework that addresses some of the the issues that we look at when we're trying to plan for a new form of mobility. And really this MCTI framework at this time anyways is geared towards Michigan's metropolitan planning organizations, whom are encouraged to utilize local knowledge from subject matter experts and to collectively identify new approaches to mobility while incorporating and building upon existing plans and transportation projects to initiate a clear path towards regional sustainability. So great, what does that mean? That means the MPOs can use this MCTI framework that I developed as part of this project, and they can essentially incorporate global mobility goals into their regional cohort of planning and identify collectively in essence with public and private partnerships, because that's going to be a key to planning in the future. In my final report, you'll find these are the 9 steps that I identified to implementing the Michigan Connected Transport Initiative. So an MPO or maybe a separate organization, again, it's pretty broad at this point as to who can use this, would go through these series of steps. They'd identify public and private community partners within an MPO, which is essentially what I did within the Tri-County region. They would define current transportation systems within the MPO boundary and evaluate how these services support the community. Next, they would start to look at the economic value of existing transportation services. They would, of course, identify the threats and weaknesses in current transportation services and infrastructure. Likely they already have that being recorded. Next, they would identify some of the MCTI strategies that we're going to go over here in the next couple of slides and look at how some of these goals and targets could improve the transportation services, and not just the infrastructure, but how they could also manipulate their goals in maybe in their master plan or their long-range transportation plans to also benefit the environment and enhance community resiliency. They would next prioritize these strategies that would provide the maximum benefit for their community. So really, MCTI is focusing on community-specific plans. And I'll talk about some of the challenges that might come up with that here shortly. So as a planning organization, if it's an MPO, they would create an implementation plan that incorporates some of the MCTI goals and put them into a pilot project that improves the overall transportation infrastructure, likely including connected and autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and some of the infrastructure associated with those 2 future mobility concepts. After they go through their pilot project, after they complete their pilot project, they would evaluate the local success and the regional impacts. And then lastly, one of the bigger things that starts to connect to the broader picture is reviewing policy issues that inhibit or limit effective MCTI implementation. All right, so again, just briefly touching on the fact that the MCTI focuses on just 5 out of the 17 total Sustainable Development Goals, the global goals that we had talked about before. Let's see. So going into it, as far as what the 5 categories are that I chose and we'll be going into, these include good health and well-being, affordable and clean energy, work and economic growth, industry, infrastructure and innovation, and also sustainable communities. So briefly touching on the methodology of how I got up to this point. Again, it's based on qualitative stakeholder working groups, but prior to that, the goals and recommendation derive basically from an extensive and systematic review of current publications, on social and connected mobility. This was actually kind of part of my thesis research when I was in graduate school. And I found that auto-coded themes among these publications included social, environment, economic, and governance. And these were populated using a qualitative computer analysis software called NVivo. What I found when doing that research was that these themes or these codes closely align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that was kind of the beginning of this idea of creating something that links to a more global review process. All right, so here we go, jumping right into the first out of the 5 strategies or MCTI goals, which is good health and well-being. So this group focused on creating strategies that would reduce the number of deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents by using connected and autonomous vehicles. And then the electric vehicle portion comes in as to reducing illnesses caused from transport-related air pollution. So some of the strategies that we looked at, or some of the goals that I pulled directly from the Sustainable Development Goals targets. So these are the global goals that have been that I've incorporated with some of the future mobility language. The first being reduce the number of deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents with CAV and ITS. Second, decrease transport-related pollution and greenhouse emissions with electric vehicles. And 3, decrease reliance on cars and emphasize walkability. So these 3 targets or strategies are what I sat down with the stakeholder groups and said, okay, these are the global goals that we're trying to fit into the Tri-County region. You as experts in the field, professional stakeholders, give me what you got for ideas on how to tackle some of these, pretty broad goals. And so what we did is we sat down, we had sticky notes, we had drawing boards, we had great conversations, usually that ended up running out of time because once we got the conversation going, there was a lot of really great ideas. And then I myself was recording everything, facilitating the conversation, collecting sticky notes afterwards, and then putting all of this into a really great report. So just to touch briefly on some of the recommendations that this group came up with as part of the good health strategies. One being providing access to a network of electric vehicle charging stations and increasing location visibility. Second, develop policies that facilitate the expansion of CAV and EV infrastructure. Again, I alluded to this just briefly, but there's some challenges with that because even on a federal level, we don't have quite a lot of tangible direction with connected and autonomous vehicles, to say the least. So this becomes a dilemma for trying to plan at a much smaller local or regional level because we can't quite figure out where we align as to how can we set the stage for success and plan proactively now and not wait for federal guidance, which is usually then associated with federal funding and so forth. So there are definitely challenges that present themselves with completing some of these recommendations that our groups came up with. And again, that kind of just leads to spiraling into somewhat of a rabbit hole discussion because, there's all sorts of different elements that come into a conversation when you're talking about sustainability, of course. But staying on track was one of the challenges that we had, and it ultimately led to really great discussions. A couple of the other recommendations, and I won't read them all, build upon existing requirements to incentivize or capitalize on CAV and EV infrastructure. Utilize pilot projects to establish sufficient data on CAV and EV usage levels and record the impacts to local air quality. Again, there's a number of them, usually ranging in 5 to 6 recommendations per category. And what we did is we took it a step further as a stakeholder group. We identified, okay, here's the goals that we're trying to meet. And the goals are broadly what the MPOs would be trying to target and plan for. They say, okay, for good health strategies, number 1, I think as an MPO, we want to try to incorporate this into our long-range transportation plan. Let's go with strategy 1. So they would flip to the next page and they'd say, okay, great, here's some recommendations. And in the report, you'll see there's recommendations, suggested partnerships for success, and then also some suggested indicators so you can essentially track your success and measure, how well you're reaching these strategies. Hope that makes sense. I know it's a lot of moving parts. But let's jump into the next category, which is affordable and clean energy. Now, this group focused on energy options for electric vehicle transportation, including efforts to promote access to renewable energy options. Here's some of the strategies that we pulled from the Global Sustainable Development Goals again. You can read them on the screen, but they range from promoting investment in clean energy research, facilitating access to electric vehicle charging stations, and again, this to tie in CAV, it could be smart and connected infrastructure. Really, these goals are intended to be broad. Third one, enhancing regional cooperation to facilitate access to clean energy options. Now, talking about some of the recommendations that we came up with for the clean and affordable energy strategies. One being identifying or creating regional financial support systems, of course, that promote startups affiliated with renewable energy initiatives. Another being promoting visibility and increasing the quantity of alternative fuel corridors. Third, invest in education and public outreach of connected and autonomous vehicles and electric vehicle operations and the infrastructure associated, and also the accessibility of this infrastructure to ease range anxiety. So that recommendation is really getting at the idea or the notion that we as the public are not necessarily familiar with connected and autonomous vehicles or electric vehicles, or what really all this future mobility means and how we're going to access it, how we're going to use it. And those are really two sides of the same coin, is how are individuals going to incorporate this into their personal lifestyle, and how are communities or cities going to incorporate this into their existing transportation systems. The third MCTI category is work and economic growth. So this one looks at focusing on economic development, local economic development, or regional economic development associated with innovative transportation technologies. So what we talked about a lot in this group was job creation and retention for the creative class and also the working class, looking at youth involvement, youth development, educational programs that assist in establishing career pathways outside of the traditional four-year career. One of the stakeholders that we had was from Southeast Michigan WIN agency, and she had just completed as an organization a skills gap analysis and looking at our traditional electrical engineers or computer programmers outside of just hands-on industry, automotive industry workers, and where we're going to fall behind as a state, essentially, when trying to move forward as a tier 1 OEM, Michigan auto-based state. How do we really leverage that? So here are some of the strategies, again, that are directly related to the global 2030 agenda. First being achieve higher levels of economic productivity through diversification of the existing automotive industry to include CAV, EV, and ITS innovation. So we had some individuals from Ford on our stakeholder groups. They're doing their own thing. How do we as a community or as an MPO start to really kind of pull into learning what they're learning, share what we have, create basically a public and private partnership that benefits planning for future mobility. Strategy 2, support job creation and entrepreneurship in future mobility industry. 3, creative and innovative employment strategies for connected transport. And some of the recommendations that we as a stakeholder group focusing on economic strategies came up with was 1, conduct a skills gap analysis within an MPO boundary to acknowledge deficiencies related to the auto industry, cybersecurity, CAV and EV development. It's a new field, so how do we kind of get behind that and start to equip our youth with the resources necessary to be there when we're ready to install some of these smart and connected infrastrucures. Another recommendation, establish public and private partnerships, as I kind of mentioned, but taking it into consideration for municipalities, auto industries, local road commissions. You can tie in MDOT, you can tie in FHWA. I had individuals from all of these groups that were very willing to discuss, at least on this platform for this project. And there were plenty of takeaway items and thoughts to consider from just having discussions. One that I really enjoyed, a recommendation I really enjoyed, was facilitating hands-on training programs for youth development and or apprenticeship programs. Now this can come from employers, this could come from the municipality. Again, it's going to be funding. It boils down to funding and available resources for something like this. But there are organizations doing it, and tapping into those resources could be something to look at as part of trying to really nail down a plan for future mobility. Again, piloting smart and connected mobility solutions, whether it be corridors. At this moment, we have a really good platform as far as our governor being supportive of future mobility technologies. So that's great. That's a great tool to kind of tap into. And then lastly, we had talked about municipal strategies in place that promote educational opportunities, workforce training and development. So from an MPO standpoint, how can we start to overlay some of these targets and connect with some of the associated resources available? All right, number 4, this was our 4th out of 5 topics that we discussed, which was industry, innovation, and infrastructure. This group focused on new and existing infrastructure and trying to evaluate how we can basically equip what we already have in terms of supporting connected and autonomous vehicles or electric vehicles. A lot of this ties into ITS or smart mobility infrastructure. Again, this one relies heavily on public and private investment, but in the long run, planning for sustainability and resilient infrastructure would assist in connected mobility and planning for this, sort of setting ourselves up for success and identifying the platform through public and private partners who are interested in seeing the success of this. Again, another example, I had mentioned Ford and some of the state transportation agencies, but we also had members from Verizon that called into our stakeholder meetings and that were very interested in this. And of course, everybody has, an interest that's for themselves, but pulling all of those together and starting to identify targets that is going to balance all of these interests is really what MCTI is focusing on. So the industry strategies that we discussed in our stakeholder groups, first being facilitating resilient and connected transportation infrastructure. I mean, you can start to see how a lot of these start to overlay. A lot of discussions were similar, which was good. Enhance scientific research and innovation of sustainable deployment, upgrade artificial intelligence capabilities within the transportation industry. Some of the recommendations that our group came up with: establish a system engineering process that identifies context-specific solutions. I really liked that one because that goes into some of those first steps that we highlighted at the beginning of this discussion, which is looking at your specific transportation system. Where's the weaknesses? Where are the strengths? How can CAV or EV benefit your community in a specific way? Because it's going to be different community to community across the state of Michigan, across the entire nation, right? And then when we start looking at crossing boundaries of MPOs, what does that look like? So starting somewhere small with focusing on your region, your MPO, is what we have thought to be the first step towards success. Again, incorporating public involvement to prioritize and identify the critical assets within a community that could benefit by using CAV and EV. So, of course, a good example of this would be connected vehicles near hospitals or healthcare facilities, so that the accessibility of the elderly population to these facilities that oftentimes have large parking lots or something of that nature, but assisting some of our populations through this technology is kind of the goal of this target. Another recommendation: integrate connectivity with resiliency and revitalization in transportation planning. I'm going to say that one again because this one, it sounds like a lot of words, but if you start to really dig into what it says and start to visualize it, I think this one was great. Integrate connectivity with resiliency and revitalization in transportation planning and infrastructure. So when I look at this recommendation, I see the different levels of planning, and I see connectivity being one, resiliency and revitalization. So almost like layers of planning, and how do these all start to mesh together, again, to find a balance. The fifth recommendation we came up with: MPOs to provide a uniform guidance on CAV and EV implementations. So this uniform guidance would essentially address driver and vehicle expectations, and this would establish a platform for public benefit. So again, I know this is a lot of words, a lot of information coming at you. I strongly encourage you to look at the report. I believe that Jen will be posting that online shortly. And again, feel free to reach out. We have one more category to discuss. The last one being sustainable communities. So this group focused on regional solutions that promote equal access to safe and affordable, sustainable transportation systems. So again, considering equity as another layer into that planning process. Examples include multimodal hubs. One of the ideas that our group had was to turn parking lots into a multimodal hub with ambassadors there, which kind of came from the recent auto show in Detroit, where they were piloting some connected vehicle projects for people to just kind of view. And the idea of having an ambassador at a multimodal hub is for those people who don't necessarily have smartphones. They aren't they haven't even been really exposed to the idea of these new forms of mobility. So having somebody there to assist the public, I thought was a great idea. And that idea came from somebody from MDOT who was working directly on the auto show and some of the connected vehicle technologies that the public was going to be exposed to there. So talking about the 3 strategies pulled from the Sustainable Development Goals, these include equitable distribution of the benefits that a connected transportation network would improve the quality of life for all. So not just looking at, for maybe private industries per se, but not just necessarily looking at where's the profit at, but how is this distribution of connected vehicles and a connected network, smart corridors per se, how is that going to benefit everybody in a community? Strategy 2, support positive economic, social, and environmental linkages between urban and rural areas through future mobility solutions. And the 3rd, providing access to safe and affordable, sustainable, autonomous transit. So again, very broad. But the recommendations that our stakeholder group identified in this Sustainable Communities Work Group include using demonstrations such as mobility challenges. I know that was a recent thing with in Michigan, was to have a mobility challenge for connected vehicles. But this would incentivize community interaction and transportation, community interaction with new transportation technology. So it would give them hands-on exposure, essentially, is the idea of having sort of demonstrations within a community. Another recommendation that we identified, implement diverse solutions to accessing CAVs to promote equitable access. So again, this comes into the idea of people that don't have smartphones, people that don't have, Verizon bill pay or Verizon auto pay on their phones, or people who still are using cash, things like that. How does these new forms of mobility become accessible to everybody? This recommendation I really liked, provide a mobility ecosystem that offers a variety of options. So again, this becomes kind of like a multimodal hub, something that can be used from maybe an empty parking lot, but provide bike shares, provide scooters, provide CAV, provide a lot of different options, and not just one or two, but provide something that people across different ages could access and feel comfortable accessing. Equity of operations. So MPOs are encouraged to establish an equity of operations and how CAVs and EVs would operate through cities and neighborhoods to provide equitable accessibility, again, versus targeting where the profit is. And lastly, identify a large-scale connectivity model to incentivize transit agency involvement with CAV. So looping in transit agencies, when you look at the report and you see partnerships, indicators, transit is a huge one, along with a variety of other public and private partnerships. So some of the next steps for maybe elevating the MCTI project would be expand stakeholder outreach. Again, as I said, I started working in the Tri-County region, and then as I needed additional expertise, I reached out to primarily the metro region because they're doing a lot of work in this area, which was really great because these individuals could assist with the conversation, but in the long run, if the MCTI was being vetted, then people from the metro region could really provide assistance to the planning process for other MPO areas. And I also think that including public involvement, public opinion, outside of just stakeholder conversations with experts is key, of course. Another next step would be quantitative analysis of the recommendations and indicators to create a scoring methodology. So you don't just have these broad goals, these broad recommendations. Sure, that's great, and that becomes simpler to in some ways to identify how you would like to, you select one goal out of one category, but to really take this a step further and have it kind of be a statewide methodology, I believe that there would need to be a quantitative analysis to the indicators to have a little bit more of a tangible, I guess, element to those. So again, I thank you all for virtually calling into my presentation. I appreciate you listening to everything I had to say and taking an interest in my project. I really look forward to any questions or comments that you guys have, and maybe the MCTI project will grow into one of your areas of the state. Thank you.